today we have with us Miss Laura Murray, who is the author of the Joseph Johnson book, To Do Good to My Indian Brethren. And she's going to be speaking with us today. Miss Murray?
Hi. Oh, wow. I see, I have to say it's a pretty ugly cover, but it's a good book, I hope. It's the ugliest cover of any book I've written. But I was still happy to see it again and just spend some time with it over the last little while because, it's 20 years old. I just, hearing from you guys, it made me realize that, oh, it was 20 years ago. It was a long time ago. But, and so it was a really actually welcome opportunity to return to it a little bit. And, I'll introduce myself a little bit. I live in Kingston, which is halfway between Toronto and Montreal, and it's due north of Syracuse, which means it's pretty much due north of the first Brothertown as well. And I studied at Cornell and for my PhD, and I grew up in Toronto. And in fact, so I'm what we say in Canada these days is I identify as a settler, in fact, on my mother's side, several grandparents ago, several generations back, one of my ancestors was granted 200 acres of land in the 1790s. And it's not quite clear to me who he was, but it's said that he was a Hessian soldier who was fighting for the British during the Revolution. So he was what we call a loyalist, and he was given this land. And that land actually stayed in our family until the 1980s. So I didn't really think about that or know about that until fairly recently, but it produces for me a very direct connection for these periods of colonialism that I'm interested in. And it's motivating a lot of work I'm doing right now on the treaty history of Southern Ontario. So as you may know, before the Revolution, in 1763, King George issues a royal proclamation, and it says that any Indian lands that are west of the Appalachians are not allowed to be moved into by settlers unless there is official treaty-making process with a delegate of the Crown. So no white person can just go in and buy property or just move in or whatever unless there is this formal process. And indeed, as I think about it now, that was one of the causes of the American Revolution because it made this hard Western boundary on the 13 colonies, which was not welcome for populations that were growing, and their land was already farmed out, in some cases, and the younger sons, everybody wanted to move west there from the colonies. So the Royal Proclamation, though, continued to apply when the Loyalists moved north of Lake Ontario. And so it still governs treaty relations in Canada to some extent, or I could say it does again since 1982 when our new constitution in Canada recognized treaty rights. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Canada, a lot of change about this, and a lot of sort of new ways of thinking about how to deal with these colonial histories, and it all goes back to the 18th century. So I've been working on the treaty for Kingston, Ontario, which was 1783, and because I started to realize, as I started to think about this treaty history, wow, I actually know something about the 18th century. But 20 years ago, I was working in these archives, looking at the American Revolution and looking at American Indian history, and now I'm just across the border. Kingston is on Lake Ontario, so it really is like pretty much right on the border. Most of the Canadian population lives really near the US border, in fact. And so this work has allowed me to just have a different perspective on some of those histories that are very much tied up with the development of Brothertown and the experience of Indigenous people during the American Revolution. So I found that really kind of a lovely circular thing that can happen at middle age. Like you're kind of like, oh, I forgot that I know this, and I can make some contributions based on that. And I'm really involved in contemporary political stuff to do with Indigenous studies and heritage studies in the place I live. So when I heard from you guys that you wanted to talk about this book, I thought, well, it really was taking me full circle, and I hadn't hadn't read it or worked on this stuff very much since. And it's not that I lost interest in Joseph Johnson. It's that I got caught up in more present day kinds of Indigenous issues. And then from that, I got involved, you know, I have a short attention span, I guess. I got involved in looking at copyright policy. I worked on that for about 10 years. And lately I've been working a lot more on community history, oral history, archival history again. And so I hadn't really been working in this field because I got distracted by all these other things. And now I'm kind of turning back to it. And it was really a welcome opportunity, because I truly think that this young man, you know, he was so young when he died, but he was a remarkable young man. And one of the things that was remarkable about him is that we can read his writings, because there are so many, there were so many opportunities in which they might have been lost, and we don't really know how, especially the diaries came to be in the Dartmouth College archives. But how I first discovered Johnson was, I was writing a dissertation, this was in the early 90s, about the kind of playing Indian stuff that the colonists were doing during the Revolution, most famously the Boston Tea Party, you know, sort of dressed up in red face or whatever before they dropped the tea in the harbor. And I wanted to know more about the colonial history from the Indigenous point of view. And I came across this book, you may have seen it, it's from the 1930s, and it's called The Letters of Eliezer Wheelocks Indians. And the title is quite telling, right? This idea that he sort of owned them, like Eliezer Wheelocks Indians. And so when I read those, and those are all the letters of Johnson and all his classmates, I was really, you know, kind of shocked and disturbed by the ways in which they were clearly expected to perform this abject stance. Like they just always had to be abject before God, abject before Wheelock, and always just talking about how awful they were and how sinful they were. But they were really young, like they're teenagers. They're writing these letters. Some of them are as young as 12. They're writing these letters. And I guess now, again, 20 years later, when I know a lot more about the history of residential schools in Canada, and I don't know so much about them in the US, but in Canada, they became obligatory in the years after the 1860s, and were, without a doubt, this systemic tool of violent colonialism and abuse. And so when I wrote this book, I didn't really necessarily think of Wheelock School as a residential school, is the way we think about it now. But when I read it now, I think about that, and I think about the abuse that these students really were suffering. But then I started writing about those letters and trying to figure out, is there a way we can read them against the grain and see that the students they're doing what they have to do, but they're not necessarily as brainwashed as they seem, or this religion may actually be very meaningful to them in ways that I can't really perceive. And I wasn't brought up going to the church. To me, this was very, you know, it was one of the challenges of working with this material is the Indigenous life ways were very distant to me or hard for me to access so much later and as a non-Indigenous person. But so was the religion. Like, you know, this particular brand of Christianity was as culturally foreign to me as, you know, I think, you know, in some ways as the way the Mohegans were living. So it took I guess I would say it took a lot of imagination for me to try and think, all right, and this is what I always approach historical documents, thinking, like, people do things for reasons, you know, and so what is this, you know, can I try and imagine what it would be like to be in this world? And both the religion and the other Indigenous cultural frameworks were hard for me to imagine at first. And I think, so when I was getting towards the end of just the one chapter that I wrote at that time about those letters, I went to Dartmouth and came across the diaries. And I think it was when I came across the diaries of Johnson that I really realized, okay, I can see a really fully rounded person here who has many different lives in a way. So I don't know, one of you said that you've read the book or read some of the book, but can I read to you aloud from the book a little bit so that I bring us all onto the same page?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, because I thought that I might just start. Again, I'm reminding myself of this as well. So by reading just a little thing that Joseph Johnson wrote, maybe sometime around 1773, and he addresses it to inquiring friends or to strangers. And it is not really clear what kind of a document it was, but it's a bit of a self-introduction. So I'll just read this to you. Would you know, kind sir, who the composer of this discourse is? Be pleased to read the following. I am an Indian of the Mohegan tribe, known by the name of Joseph Johnson, educated by the Reverend Eliezer Wheelock, D.D., Doctor of Divinity, whose school I left when I was 14 years of age. And in the 3rd month of my 15th year, I was sent amongst the 6 nations, and I spent about 2 years in those parts, keeping school. Afterwards, I left the school entirely, Reverend Eliezer Wheelock, D.D., entirely. And from that time, I been wandering up and down in this delusive world. Some of my time I spent at Providencetown, keeping a school. Some of my time I have spent upon the ocean wide. I have been down eastward, as far as to the Western Islands twice. Curvo and Flores I have seen, and to the southward I have been as far to the West Indies. Seen also the islands between Antigua and Grenada, and again from Antigua I have sailed down leeward, sailed by the Virgin Islands, also by Santa Cruz, Puerto Rico, down as far as to Mona. And after so long time, even in my 21st year, I safely arrived to my native place. There I spent 1 year in working upon my farm. So you have this young man, and he grew up at Mohegan, on Mohegan land, and he goes to school with Wheelock. He gets sent, Wheelock had this idea that he was going to send these Algonquian-speaking peoples from New England up to be missionaries and teachers amongst the Haudenosaunee. But although there were some relationships between these people, they spoke completely different languages, they had completely different political structures and cultures and everything. So this kid, he's 15 years old, he shows up there, he doesn't speak the language, he doesn't really, know anything, and he has a really hard time. So in some of the letters, we see that documented. I don't know, I can't, whether he quits or whether he gets fired or whatever, but he doesn't behave becomingly. And so he takes off and he goes to sea on a whaling voyage, which he does for a couple of years. And it's when he returns from the whaling voyage that he starts to keep this diary. And I don't know whether he might have kept a diary before as well, but it seems to me that he launched it with a great sense of purpose upon his landing at Newport, Rhode Island. And it's part of a kind of a project that he undertook at that time to kind of reassess his life and think about where he was going. And that reassessment seems to have to do partly with religion, Christian religion, and partly to do with his relationship to Mohegan. He's returning to Mohegan. And so it's just a remarkable document because it tells about him and his personality, and it also tells about the world he lived in this much more insider way than I think, it really exists for this world. Sanson Occam writes a ton, but we don't have any of the sort of daily life kind of thing from his writings. And that's what I find so moving about this diary. It's weird reading somebody's diary. Do any of you keep diaries? No, I don't keep a diary. Like, I would be too embarrassed to read my own diary like a year later, never mind worrying about other people reading it, right? But is it, when I first came across it and I was reading it in manuscript at Dartmouth, you feel kind of creepy. You're reading, what is not meant for your eyes. It may have been meant for Wheelock's eyes, part of it. Like, I think we can't assume that it was a private document. I write about that in the book. So we can't assume that it was entirely private, but it is very personal. And also another thing about diaries is they don't explain stuff. If you're keeping a diary, you're going to say like, oh, George got on my nerves again. You know, I went to such and such a place. You just don't explain. So all these people, we don't know who the people are. There's no real explanation of anything. And so you're plunged into that world. You're sort of inside the person's head, but you're really missing most of the stuff in the person's head. Like you only have the little bit of the surface. But even so, I think it is just a remarkable sort of intimate experience to read this diary. And again, to just remember how young this man was and how traumatized really he was by, you know, his father and his mother died very young. He gets sent to this boarding school. He's had various siblings who've died, and his community is in crisis. They really, around this time, it was 1 year later that writes this diary, they lose this court case in England, and they just, once and for all, they've lost their land. And so although he's so young, he's literate in English. And not only is he literate in English, but he's really literate in all these sort of polite forms of how to address white people with power. And that's what makes him really important at this point, when all the people, not just the Mohegans, of course, the Narragansetts, Pequots, and people from other communities in New England are just having to figure out what to do. So I don't know, I think maybe, I don't know if you want to ask any questions right now, you could. Otherwise, I think I might read a little of the diary and talk about that. But is there anything that you want to raise before I do? Okay, I'll keep going. So he starts this diary on October 10th, 1771 in Providence. And he says, this 9th of October being chiefly spent in settling with the whalemen, which went in the sloop Ranger belonging to Mr. Nicholas Cook of Providence. So he's getting paid, you know, for his work on this whaler. And the next morning, this morning set out from my home in company with several of my shipmates in Mr. Field's packet boat bound to Nantucket. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, arrived at Newport town. I landed my things at one Mr. Charles Devons, a cooper by trade, lodged there this night. October the 11th. This day I spent in looking for a passage to Connecticut, and I found none. I got in with Mr. Thomas George to board me till I could get a passage. Lodged there this night. October the 12th. Spent chief of this day in looking for a passage, and found one Barnabas Hinchley of Falmouth with a load of lumber, ready sold, only to unload. This afternoon I went with one Daniel, an Indian, to the place they call Newtown, at the house of one Jack Lowe, a Negro man, and got acquainted with one Sarah Hazard, or Bunker. Tarried there a short time, then went down to Thomas George's, promising to return soon. Accordingly I did, and spent the afternoon with the girls and a bottle of wine to cheer up the spirits. This night lodged at Thomas George's. I'll just read one more entry and then I'll comment. October the 13th, Sunday. The fore part of this day I went to the church, the after part to the Quakers' meeting, where chiefly the Negroes were convened. After dusk I walked the town up and down, lodged at Thomas George's. So he lands there, you know, he's been on this whaling boat, and he has to figure out how to get home and how to get his stuff home. And this is a really complicated process. And, you know, I think if I were teaching this, you know, to young people his age, you know, at the time he's writing this, just to imagine, like, no cell phones, no nothing. He's got to, there's no public transit. Can't rent a car. There's no way he can get there, but he has to get there by boat. And the next few entries over the next few weeks, we see this really hard time he has, because what happens is he gets distracted by Sally Hazard, which is just a name that you would put in a novel if you made it up. He gets distracted by Sally Hazard, and he's loaded his stuff on this boat, and the boat leaves without him. And he loses all his stuff. And this is a big deal, because he's been at sea for a couple of hours, a couple of years. I don't know what's in his bag, but it's all his earthly belongings. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to comment on what might be in that chest that he was looking for, finally recovered north of Hartford up the Connecticut River, and he did get it all back. It's an amazing saga, just crazy, like getting his stuff and getting back home to Mohegan. But I lived in New London for 10 years and had the opportunity many times to be in classes and talks there's a town historian there, Sally Ryan. And there are later comments in Joseph Johnson's diary where he's speaking of, making busks. These are corset busks, and other items that are pretty commonly made of whale baleen. I believe he stocked up a bunch of baleen in that chest and was ready for a cottage industry to keep him, in money and in work for the next several years. Seems that was a big little, side industry of the whaling industry in New London. It wasn't only about the oil. Some other parts were used, and those whales that had baleen, that was the thing for umbrella spines and corset stays and buggy whips, horse carriage whips. Those were an industry in New London.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that I didn't think of back at the time. Because he's making spoons and broom handles and all these things out of wood. But yeah,
right.
I did struggle with that thinking, because I knew that somehow I didn't put all that together. That's very cool. But so the thing that's interesting too is that he goes to this place called Newtown, which at the time I haven't, maybe other people have done research on this since, but it might be the Black neighborhood of Newport. And so that's interesting to think. I mean, you all know, if you've read any Moby Dick, that what a multiracial, multicultural environment the whaling ships were. And so he goes there with this guy, Jack Lowe. And then later on, it's part of this whole story of getting home, he meets this guy he calls Musty, so some kind of mixed race person. And I don't know about Sally Hazard, but the funny thing was that I remember is I was giving a talk about this, 20 years ago. And in Providence at the John Carter Brown Library. And there was an elderly woman there, like in her 80s. And a very blue blood New England white lady. And I was giving a talk about this, and I, mentioned Sally Hazard, and she said, I know Sally Hazard. I was like, no, you're not that old. but she traced her family back to, because there were white hazards and there were black hazards, and no doubt indigenous hazards too. And they, by the 1990s, when I was talking to her, they weren't talking to each other. But it did turn out that I think it was the mayor of Newport had a daughter named Sarah Hazard, who would have been about the right age and would have been a white girl. So, who knows who she was. But Johnson, is so caught up with her. And so the emotional elements of these early parts of the diary about finding his stuff, mooning over Sally and figuring out, if she really loves him, and worrying about his own health because he's sick, and he goes to the doctor and he gets this medication and they don't seem to be working. He dissolves the medication in a gallon of rum, as he's instructed to do, and it doesn't seem to work. And then the real drama of getting home. And again, if it were a novel, it sets it up where it's not easy to go home. And even though this is just the real thing that happened to him, but it has this feeling of, it has this greater emotional import. It's hard to get home to Mohegan. And of course, it's hard to hold on to Mohegan because although he talks, about in the passage I just read from when he introduces himself, he says, I spent 1 year working on my farm. But that was land that was no longer deemed by the colonial government to belong to the Mohegans. But clearly, it belongs to him in his heart, and it belongs to his family in the sense that they're farming it, they're clearing up the brush, they're planting things, they're harvesting corn, they're husking corn, they are raising pigs, they're really inhabiting this space. And some of those farming practices might be colonial farming practices, and some of them may predate colonial practices, the corn harvest, for example. And so it really is their land. But his time there is very difficult. It's very hard for him to make a living. It's hard because he's not healthy, and it's hard because he's struggling with his relationship to Jesus Christ, and he's got to work all the way through that. But here again, unlike some of the letters that these students wrote when they were students of Wheelocks, here he's writing about a relationship to the Christian religion, which is completely experienced through Indigenous community. And I think and it's also, what's the word? It's every day, it's mixed in with work, it's mixed in with all these things. And, you know, I guess that is actually how religion works, because it's a part of life for people who practice it. But that made it seem to me much more possible to understand, I suppose, that he needed some direction in his life. His father himself had been a Christian. He'd grown up that way. He wasn't like a convert, you know, from nowhere. That was a kind of a touch point for him that he wanted to return to. And so one of the passages of the diary that I think brings all these things together, I used it as one of the epigraphs to the book. He says, "Have I departed from all iniquity to serve the only living and true God? If I have not, may the Lord Jesus Christ grant I now may begin, whilst called today. I read the New Testament chief of this day, and the afternoon towards night I helped shell corn, and it was very late when we left off. This evening was very pleasant after the moonrise." So, you know, this is a balanced day, and it has this kind of, he's not sure about where he stands with Christ, but he does know how to husk corn, and he looks at the moon and he appreciates it, and he's very much like in the world as he does that. Here's another diary entry. "This morning looks very likely for a storm, but perhaps not. This morning we are left alone, our uncle and aunt being invited to Thanksgiving at Niantic, and are gone. Today, boiled some pumpkin for the fatting hogs, read some of the Holy Scriptures. Nothing of any great consequence has been done this day. This evening was visited by young Sam Cooper. This night I began to call upon the name of the Lord." And then he writes underneath, "2 weeks since I got home." So a whole bunch of things are happening here. The uncle and aunt have gone to Niantic, and the diary just, it shows all this moving back and forth. They're always traveling, you know, to the different communities. And it's very, very multi-tribal, I guess we could say. The Christians amongst these people moving back and forth.
Yeah.
And they hardly have any contact really with white ministers. I mean, occasionally he'll say, "I went to hear somebody, you know, preach or whatever," but they're really conducting their own worship, and they're conducting it amongst all these communities. And so this is you know, the foundation of Brothertown, really, right? All these relationships that they have amongst each other. And he boils some pumpkin for the fatting hogs. And then this night I began to call upon the name of the Lord. So it seems like this, you know, as far as I understand, this is sort of some feeling of conversion, a commitment that he has that day. But the other declaration he makes that night is 2 weeks since I got home. And so these two things happen together. And I guess at the time I was writing this book, at least, a lot of people who were writing about Christianity in Indigenous communities were seeing Christianity as either brainwashing or a kind of a tool used very strategically. And I guess I felt, again, not being a Christian myself, but I felt just reading this stuff that, no, he really believed this. This is not just strategy. And his father and his community around him all believed it. It was part of what their community was. But neither was it brainwashing. I mean, it was self-help. It was his metaphorical structures. And another one of the epigraphs I used for the book is from Ezekiel, where he talks about, "As a shepherd seeketh out his flock in the day that he was among his sheep that are scattered, so I will seek out my sheep, and I will deliver them out of all places where they have been scattered in the cloudy and dark day. And I will bring them out from the people and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them to their own land and feed them upon the mountains of Israel by the rivers and in all the inhabited places of the country." So, you know, this is the kind of language that inspired people like Johnson and Occam to think, okay, things suck here in Connecticut right now. Like we have no land, where we can barely feed ourselves. It's just horrible. But we do have this relationship with the Oneidas through our schooling with Wheelocks, and maybe we can go up there because they have land and they are governing themselves, and maybe there will be hope. So, you know, that kind of language from the Bible was really a part of what motivated them and gave them political, I guess we call it political capital. Like, you know, it was like a way they could help to think about being together. Of course, that's combined with the fact that they are related and have been related for generations and speak, you know, they're worshiping in, I don't know exactly, I'm not a linguist and I don't know how closely all those languages were related at the time, but they were worshiping in their own language at Mohegan anyway. And it seems like the people from the other communities could understand it. Another, just on November the 14th, he says, we spent the evening in singing. David Fowler of Long Island was the chief, and some of the young women belonging to Stonington also. We spent the evening very pleasant. This night was married one Jonathan Nunsich of Niantic to somebody Ashpo of Mohegan. Mr. Ockham married the couple and have now spent the evening in such manner. So there's a lot of singing, and it just came up, we were just chatting just before, you know, everybody got on, but we were talking about your recent singing event. And it's very clear that that singing is a huge mode of their collective worship and enjoyment and camaraderie, and also again about the intimacy of the worship. There's this one occasion on which he reports, you know, staying up all night talking about religious matters, and it got too cold, so they got into bed, and they were in bed talking about all this stuff, and then they fall asleep at morning time. So again, this is, you know, intimacy of this kind of thing. It's not anything highly formal. And then by the time in the second diary that Johnson is teaching at Farmington, he spends a lot of his time making hymn books, writing out, as he says, pricking them out, writing out hymns for people to sing, and it's really important to him. And I don't know how continuous this kind of singing practice was with comics. So if any of you want to tell me anything about that event or what your theories are about that, I'm really quite intrigued by it.
I can maybe elaborate a little bit. The Joseph Johnson language is very specific, that he's, you know, pricking out gamuts, and 18th century language. Pricking out is handwriting, it's manuscript, but specifically for music notation. So he's very specific. Also, gamut implies music, the musical scale, and the kind of little like 4-page primer sheets that were sort of made to help people get going singing. Already they were a thing in New England. These gamuts, sometimes as an early introduction to a book of tunes, or sometimes just free floating as their own little, you know, 4-page thing. And then by kind of a process of metaphor, then this introduction to the tune book becomes the name of like the tune book. The entire tune book can be referred to as a gamut, and he seems to be using the word in that sense. And yeah, his time in Farmington, he's just constantly pricking out notes and making gamuts and binding them up himself and giving them as gifts, both to native and settlers, English. He's on friendly terms with the landlord, the landowner that the Indians are renting from in Farmington. Apparently, they've been all completely dispossessed and are paying the Wadsworth family like they need more money. And they're you know, the landlords at that time, but he's on good terms with them, and they get together and sing, and he makes a gamut for Wadsworth and hands it to him. And so, you know, I've been on this mad quest since you know, reading your book, Laura, trying to find one of these gamuts. Like he names a couple of tune names earlier in the book that he learns of visiting Niantic at a singing at Occam's house. Mm-hmm. and there are in music literatures and researches in recent decades, especially Nicholas Temperley, Hymn Tune Index, there's actually pretty exhaustive knowledge. There's actually like pretty much every single dang tune name that ever was published in print in an English language hymnal for singing. Pretty much it's known and cataloged. And those tunes were never published until like 40 years after his lifetime. Or maybe they were different tunes that just happen to have the same name, because they do not exist in the English literature of hymnody. And that's really striking, and it's been really frustrating, you know, for me as like the music researcher, because I'm trying to find, you know, these connections you're asking for, Laura. Like, well, this is interesting. There's so much singing around Joseph Johnson, around Samson Occam, and then there's Thomas Comoak in 1845. Well, how did that happen? Is this a coincidence? What's in between? And yeah, there turns out no one's really connected the dots before, but we've been able to find a lot of singing, some of the same people, and then they overlap the next generation, then they overlap the next generation, and then there's a report in this decade, and then in that decade, and then in New York, and then Wisconsin, and then in Indiana with another attempted Brothertown settlement, and then we find clues and references and comments about singing of these people every decade, every generation, every state, every place they go to. It was continuous. It was taught to each other, by each other. It stayed in the Indian communities and remained a huge thing, and then just got huger with Kamuk, and somehow was mostly lost as a practice in between and since then. And but there was a selection made from the Kamuk tune book of 45, and then a singing of from that, maybe first time, like 150 years. A lot of this stuff has been sung. Happened almost to the day a month ago in Connecticut. I've had correspondence from some Narragansett who are looking at it in the deposited copy there, and they're looking at the tune book and reading, and I got this text message about, "Well, this is really interesting booklet, and this is so interesting, the singing that you had on Quinnipiac Island." I didn't correct that. I loved it. Quinnipiac Island. Now we were on Quinnipiac Island. That's going to be our metaphor for New Haven. But this was in a Yale building on Yale grounds in New Haven. But it was very pointedly pointed out that it's Quinnipiac land on our front cover and title page. And so now that's Quinnipiac Island.
I think you see some really interesting combination of oral tradition and writing in this situation.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, he really wanted to write that stuff down, and in some ways he seemed to feel that it was necessary for the students that they have these books. But on the other hand, in his diaries, he's mostly learning them from other people, in singing. And
this is really interesting, important mixture, the oral and the literate in these traditions, and that's a big argument I have to make some of the connections. A very important feature.
Yeah. And I'm working with some people here in Ontario at a place called Alderville, which was a Mississauga community, which is a subgroup of, I guess, what you would call Chippewas. And they became Methodists, I don't know, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And they had a big Methodist church there and so on. And one of the men that I'm working with in that community now, his great-grandfather was a singing teacher, and he traveled around teaching, I presume, hymns, but he also was, and even to the white communities around there. But he also seemed to be known for seducing women, and he would the Indian agents didn't like this guy at all, because he'd wander around teaching singing and making people love him. But there too, I would say that the hymns, maybe they hooked in with also previous musical traditions in some way, even though they're so different from whatever the indigenous singing would have been. They may have moved into that place of singing together as simply just such an important community practice. It is fun to sing those hymns. They're not, they're pretty, I think the singing style was pretty forceful and a collective experience. Anyway, so there was singing, but there was so much work. Like, that's another thing, that all the letters that he writes about trying to, get land from the Oneidas, they represent a kind of labor too, and you can really feel that. Oh, he has to write this letter to the governor of Connecticut, or he has to write a letter to his rich patron, and it's a really laborious process by which he has to both be forceful and convincing, and also as humble as he is expected to be, being an Indian, as he would say, like a poor good for nothing, et cetera, et cetera. So you feel a sense of labor there. But then meanwhile, there's also, as we talked about a little bit before, all this work of shelling corn and sorting apples and getting wood and cutting brush and mending shoes and sewing and mending chairs and all these kinds of things. And of course, that was a kind of labor that indigenous people did all over New England and in the settled areas, is making baskets and selling them and so on. So now, on the one hand, it was a pretty touch and go kind of way of living. On the other hand, again, just as I was talking before about the difficulty that Johnson had getting home, baskets were really essential necessities of life for everybody in those times, in the absence of cardboard boxes and plastic bins and whatnot, right? And so, I mean, there was a market for them. And there was a market for wooden spoons, because they weren't just something that like hipsters bought, but they were the only spoons that everybody had. So they were, an essential part of the economy, the people who were making these things. But it was also just a lot of work, because they had to do both the marketing, making and the marketing, right? And they had to go door to door and sell them and so on. So there's that going on. By the time he gets to Farmington, he really is occupying the role of a full-time teacher and spending all his time making these hymn books and so on, but also starting to organize for Brothertown. And I guess it wasn't clear to me 20 years ago, and I haven't really, I've read some of the writings on Samson Occam since, but not so much, so you may know them better. It seems to me that he and Occam just played very different roles. In some ways, Johnson was the foot soldier. He was the one who was out there traveling back and forth between Oneida, because he had lived there and worked there before, and also convening the people sort of at his base in Farmington. And trying to convince people that now is the time. And unfortunately, now was not the time. It was about the worst possible time that they could have initiated this. And if you read through his later letters, I mean, he's really at personal risk, because the Oneidas are trying to stay neutral. The Mohawks, of course, are very strongly on the British side. Sir William Johnson is sort of trying to hold it together, and Sir William Johnson and Kirkland, who's Wheelocks' buddy, are at odds. Then Sir William Johnson dies, like just on the eve of the Revolution. It was just such a hellish experience for all the Indigenous people of that area south of Lake Ontario, and it was really the time that the Confederacy broke to pieces. And has sort of been trying to get itself back in different ways. But now we have Haudenosaunee people living in Canada. Now they're divided by a state line, and then some living in the U.S. And they therefore have had very different experiences ever since. But it's very clear in that time that he has the capacity to know how to speak to the Oneidas. It's not really clear what language he was speaking in to the Oneidas. He was there for a couple of years as a teenager. Was he fluent? He seems to present himself often as going really through Sir William Johnson. But on the other hand, he's following Haudenosaunee protocol in his speeches. And they do these things like the Haudenosaunee always did. They say, well, okay, thanks you for the speech. Will you come back tomorrow? And so he has to go off and he has to wait. And they're using the language explaining to him what it would mean to be younger brethren within the Confederacy. And they use the Tuscaroras as an example of the sort of the next youngest brother. So you would be like the baby brother compared to the Tuscaroras, and explain what their obligations to him will be and what his obligations to them will be. So that's, although Sir William Johnson seems to be in some ways the fixer in this, it really is being orchestrated within Haudenosaunee protocol. And then, chaos erupts. And meanwhile, his wife, Tabitha Occam, Samson's daughter, has a baby, and then has another baby back home. And he's traveling back and forth, and he's often not there because he's trying to get permissions, get funding. And so you think about it again from the personal point of view. It was a wow, he was really putting himself on the line. And the sort of the ultimate outcome of that is we don't even know how he died, or we don't know where he died, or I don't believe anyone has discovered this yet. I haven't heard it. Maybe they have. Let me know if you find out. But really, it was a very uncertain world. Like this, wasn't like there was a sort of a line between the colonists and the British, and the indigenous people were trying to negotiate all that, and he would have been really a person of mistrust to both sides, you know, to everybody, because he was claiming that he wasn't going to get involved at all, and he really clearly didn't want to get involved at all, but nobody would have believed that. You know, there was just this really high level of panic. And so, you know, I don't know whether he died a violent death or whether he got sick or whatever. He just kind of disappears. And then in 1785 is when Brothertown finally gets established, really after the Haudenosaunee territory has become completely devastated and everybody is starting anew. And that's when the story hands off to you folks. That's when the story hands off to Brothertown. Yeah, so I don't know what questions I can answer, or what you want to tell me about more things you want to know, or how you think this connects to your histories. I'd be really interested to know.
I guess I have a question as far as how much did he actually, you know, speak with the various communities, and what was his pitch, or how did he promote the whole idea of Brothertown? And do you have any sense of, like, he approached each of the 7 parent communities, and, you know, over what period of time, and how active was he in that process?
Well, I think, you know, there were leaders from each community, and again, I mean, it seems to me that the only people involved in the Brothertown movement were Christians. So I don't know how much of the other population this leaves out, and the kind of issues there. But he, and so it was sort of through that kind of religious thing that the organization was happening. But in October 1773, there's a letter that Johnson has written, but it's from the Farmington Indians to, as they call, all our Indian brethren, and it's signed by men only in Farmington, and they say, "This once more, we of this tribe at Farmington send greeting to all our Indian brethren at Mohegan, Niantic, Pequot, Stonington, Narragansett, and Montauk. Brethren, we love you and wish your well-being both in this life and that which is to come. We ask your serious attentions a moment. Dear brethren, with humility we undertake to write unto you, begging you would remember the affair of which we so earnestly talked last spring at the town of Mohegan. We beg that you would this once more take this affair under your deliberate considerations. Let it not drop through, since we have encouragements on every side. We have encouragement from His Honor Sir William Johnson, Baronet, and things look promising. Let us take courage, friends, and let us step forward like men. We beg that you would by all means send a man out of each tribe, that they may go with us and seek a country for our brethren. Is it not worthwhile? Surely it is. Be so good as to show yourselves men, for General Johnson expects us at his house last of this month, and if we do not make our appearance, he will think we are only talkers and not worthy of notice. How foolish shall we feel if we be despised by General Johnson? But, dear brethren, we will not multiply words. Seeing that ye are men, and it is to be hoped wise men, consider of things, and do that which is right. By no means be discouraged, but, dear brethren, let us put our trust in that God who ruleth in the armies of heaven, and doeth his pleasure among the inhabitants of this lower world. If God be for us, this is enough. He can comfort us even in a wilderness. Let us consider of our condition. Let us think of our children. Let us think of time to come. We mention these things to put you in remembrance. Brethren, if the men chosen last spring be backward to go to the Mohawk country, be so good as to send others in their room and encourage one another. If money is scarce, let us try to carry a little provisions in our packs, which will be of considerable help. Let the men that go try to get the goodwill of the women, and let the kind women make a little yoke keg. We will try to help them with little provisions when they go from here. Our kind women sends a word of encouragement and says that they will make a little yoke egg to give to the travelers. So we must end wishing you all well, and we would beg that those men shall go, come to our town, be sure by the 23rd day of this month, as we purpose to set off from here the 25th of October, or of this month. So they signed this letter, and so they've been having meetings, and there aren't minutes of those meetings, right? But you know, it would seem clear from the context that they all have no land rights anymore in New England, and despite the fact that they have gone so far to assure the white folks around that they are moral and that they're good Christians and all this stuff, they're still getting treated like crap, and they're just getting, their life is getting harder and harder. It seems that they're trying to bring themselves together. And it's interesting that it's all men who are doing the leadership of this movement, because in the 19th century, in Connecticut anyway, it seems like the leaders of the community were mostly women. So I don't know, what the traditional gender roles would have been in earlier centuries. But then again, that they really need the women's help. They need them to make provisions, this corn that they can carry with them, the yoke. And they have a hard time though, and I think they partly have a hard time just because of people's poverty. And as they say, like, you may not even be able to afford to come. And it's harvest time, it's in October, they're planning to leave because they can't travel in the winter. And there's no
clams there.
There's no clams there. Yes, some of the Narragansetts say, man, there's no clams, which is so touching to me, because it shows how very specific their relationship was to their land. And of course, it's crazy to live where there isn't clams. I know, I've lived all my life without clams. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think in a lot of ways we don't know a lot of the details because there weren't really minutes of the meetings, but there are just some of these letters where you can see the kind of way that, in a way Johnson is on the edge of desperation here. Mm. His reputation is on the line. He's really trying to make Sir William Johnson and the Oneidas believe that these New England people are for real. And that they have the capacity to act on a nation-to-nation basis with the Oneidas. They're not just a bunch of individuals, but that they are a group. And he needs to, help to bring that into being before they can get the land.
Now, as I recall, after that letter, when he trekked back up to New York, it was he and Elijah Wampy, I think, were the only two that actually went. Now I think Jacob Fowler and one other person set out with them, but they ended up turning back. So I wonder how much, what was his, I wonder what his sense of their participation was, the other groups, if he felt like they were going to show up or if he was really worried that they're just kind of putting it off.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's true. And then you also think about Johnson and the Oneidas, like he's practically a kid, right? I mean, it's not like they, Occam isn't there. I don't know how old Wampy was. I can't remember anyway. Some of the people that he mentions a lot in his prayer were quite a bit older than him, like John Manapome. Was Johnson's father's age. He had fought in the French and Indian War, but so he's this very young man, and from the Haudenosaunee point of view, there's no woman there. Johnson isn't a war chief, or it would be irregular for them to take him seriously. But I guess if he had Sir William Johnson behind him, and because he had been there before and seemed to be observing their protocols, and maybe also just because they could see what had happened in the 13 colonies, and they still had, at that moment, it's just before everything fell apart for them, they still felt they had something to offer, and they could act like the older brethren. I don't know if any of you have read Ellen Taylor's book, The Divided Path. It's a supremely depressing book about what happened to
Divided Ground.
Upstate New York. Sorry, the Divided Ground. Things were certainly bad for Indigenous people in Ontario after the American Revolution, but they were less chaotic than they were south of the border, where again the Royal Proclamation was ignored after the Revolution. So it was just free for all of all sorts of charlatans moving in on that land, and so that's your history, I guess. And but at the time, you know, this is sort of the last moment where the Oneidas have Sir William Johnson trying to keep order around there, and they decide to be magnanimous. And that was a promise then that somehow or other did get kept even through the Revolution. Any other thoughts or questions about?
I have one other thought. It's not really going to go anywhere, but in when we were working on Kamuk's booklet, Kamuk writes a letter where he basically credits a man named David Fowler, who is Montauk. He credits David Fowler with speaking with the Oneida and getting in with them, and that's how we came about having our lands. Now, I haven't looked back to see when Fowler actually got to the area in New York, but I know he was there obviously before Occam came in November of 1785. But I wonder, was David Fowler there by then already? Do we know? Or was it a little after that before he arrived?
I'm not really like quite totally on top of this, but I know that Fowler was a fellow student at Wheelocks School of Joseph Johnson's, and they both served as teaching assistants or whatever in the 1760s up in Haudenosaunee country. And I can't remember now whether Fowler stayed there or went back and forth and so on, but like Joseph Johnson, he was somewhat familiar with, you know, the players and perhaps the social and political structures there. He may have spoken some Oneida language. So he was probably involved somehow. Like, I don't think, you know, he didn't leave such records. He doesn't get mentioned too much in Johnson's writing, but they both probably were important. And they had relationships with Samuel Kirkland, who was a powerful man, who ends up, by the way, getting a ton of land after the Revolution out of this deal. So he does perfectly well for himself, although he has, you know, a hard time in the missionary field.
It seems, elaborating on David Fowler and Montauk involvement, and you know, Mark's earlier question about, you know, how was this pitched, how were the others involved, was Joseph being hung out to dry? Montauk researchers, I'm thinking, now I'm confused if it's Strong or Armstrong, John Strong, right? Just Strong? Without the arm. I mean, he's got books about just, you know, Montauk in particular, and he's found, like, you know, particular letters and correspondence between David Fowler and Haudenosaunee Oneida leaders, where he's also, you know, really digging into the Brothertown ideas, and you know, Montauk viewpoint people do give David Fowler a larger share of this sort of inspiration and drive and instigation, catalyzing role of you know, really cultivating the Brothertown idea, doing the diplomacies for it. You know, not just Samson Occam, not just Joseph Johnson, but also David Fowler. Like, he was involved in substantive, you know, long distance communication manner. But I think Joseph Johnson is more important and more effective and more substantive and more mileage than, you know, Occam and Fowler put together.
Well,
we were so.
I don't know. I don't need to make that claim. I mean, I think that for one thing, you know, we only have. It's amazing that we have this amount of writing, but of course we don't have any documentation of all the face-to-face work that got done. And but it would be quite interesting to sort of track down a little bit more about Fowler and how long he spent time there and when. But you know, even if Johnson was key, again, I go back to community, because he was so clearly intensely motivated and connected to all these other communities.
Yeah.
And most immediately, he seems to have been inspired by the faith at the Farmington people put in him. And the beginning of that second diary too, right, also has this drama because he doesn't know what he's going to do. He thinks he's going to go up to Oneida country, and he stops at a crossroads. And he stops at a crossroads and he decides to go to Farmington, and then he meets the community there, and they want him to be a teacher. So they give him that responsibility, and that seems to be, you know, something that is a crossroads in his life. Those Farmington people are really important in motivating him. And but you know, they didn't leave writing, so they, you know, we don't know what the details are. And then there's his relationship with Occam, which I think, you know, from his writings is a little hard for me to parse. He admires Occam hugely, but Occam seems like to Johnson he was a very intimidating figure, and especially, you know, in the letters about whether he can marry Occam's daughter, there's a lot of that comes through. But Occam, you know, clearly had this kind of magisterialness about him. He struggled in his own life for, you know, because he was always being put down and exploited by Wheelock and so on. But I think it seems like in the community, he was the man. And then all this younger generation was sort of trying to find their own place and trying to live up to his expectations. So Johnson sort of has this fire lit underneath him. There's a lot of things that aren't clear from the writing, though. Like when he's in Farmington, it seems that he has somehow been exiled from Mohegan, and I don't know whether there was some kind of political problem or religious problem, or whether he just misses Mohegan. But it's very, very intense, his feelings about having left Mohegan. So maybe there were distances between him and Occam at different various points as well, in that way. Somebody was going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, when he goes through that big thing about Mohegan, I mean, it's like he's leaving his lover or something. And it made me wonder if is there a girl there who is just like, go away? You know, is this what he's moaning about? Or is it just really, you know, is it something else? Maybe it's his ancestry that he's thinking about, or I don't know, but it seems more like it's something that's really pushing on him, like he can't go back for some reason, or he didn't be embarrassed to go back, or something like that.
Yeah, I guess we might never really know, but it might be sort of all these kinds of things. Like again, the land is lost, so really it's he can't go back in that sense. But it also seems like maybe there was some personal thing, some reason he had to leave, and you know, it could have been that I don't know, he drank, you know, too much some night, and Occam like said, get out of here, and so whatever. Or it could be that there were political differences, and there were so many that I tried to get a handle on when I was writing this book, but it was difficult for me to do so. I mean, Zachariah, who was Johnson's uncle, seems to have been at odds with Occam. But Johnson may have been living with his uncle, and you know, and this is the kind of thing that, you know, can be kind of dismissed as infighting. But on the other hand, the reason there are these conflicts is that there are not enough resources, and this community is in crisis, and everybody's trying to figure out how to live, and everybody probably has different ideas about where to go, and so, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for those political, you know, infighting is kind of a pejorative word, and I you know, so I would sort of tend to not want to use it. Like they just didn't know what to do, and for good reason at that time. So it's partly that. But he does seem just hugely connected to that land, and I guess there's something about that makes me, and also about as was mentioned, the Narragansetts, I guess it was, who said they couldn't go to a place without clams. Like, it's funny, but it's not funny. Like, this was like a real connection that was a really big deal to move a really long distance to this completely different place, and completely different landscape, and a completely different cultural landscape. So no wonder people were ambivalent about it. And you know, so some people move, and then some people move back, and you and your genealogists probably have a much fuller idea of this than I do. I guess I'm just, yeah.
I was going to say, one thing I wanted to point out is that all the Farmington Indians left with Johnson. I mean, they all went to Brothertown. There weren't any more, as far as I understand it. There were no more of them staying in Farmington.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas all the other communities, people stayed.
Yeah, yeah. No, it seems that they were really the group that was promoting it at the time. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Maybe I should finish by reading something else. Should I finish by reading something else?
Sure.
That's great.
Let's see. Well, maybe I'll read Joseph Johnson to his wife, because it's
Just sweet.
yeah. This is August 1774. He's at Dartmouth College, and so he's gone there. He goes there once. My dear and well-beloved wife, through the great and continued goodness of God, I am well, and the Lord in whom I trust hath greatly prospered me hitherto. Oh, that the goodness of God might truly bring me to a sincere repentance and give me a sense of my indebtedness to him. And oh, that the goodness of God towards us might fill your heart with true love to him. And oh, that the Lord would enable you to put your whole trust in him at all times and in all places. So this indicates that maybe Tabitha is not so big into this stuff, right? And this was really worrying him. And when he first writes to Samson Occam asking for Tabitha's hand in marriage, he says, I take her as she is. It sort of implies that Samson really does not approve of whatever his daughter's been doing. And he's going to hand off his daughter, but he's not giving a lot of faith in her. He says, my dear, I have not forgotten you, but you are ever in my thoughts, and it is not with little grief of mind that I am obliged to be absent from you. But this is my comfort, that our God, the Lord omnipotent, reigneth, and that we are in his hands. And he goes on in this vein for a while. He says, I send you with friend Daniel Simons $5 for your relief and comfort, and a token of my sincere regards and love for you, and a sign to let you know that the Lord hath verily prospered me. I have obtained a license. I was examined yesterday by 6 ministers and was approved by all. I preached yesterday in the afternoon at the college hall, and after the exercise was over, they made general contribution. I had $30 given to me by the gentleman who came here at commencement, and 1 shilling and 7 pence besides the $30. I'm going to set off for the Mohawk country this day, and I shall come back as soon as I ever can. I wish you well, my only beloved. Fear God and keep his commandments. Live soberly, becoming a virtuous wife. I am your loving and faithful husband until death doth part us, Joseph Johnson. So she was pregnant at this time with her first child when he's writing to her, and she had that baby when Joseph was not there. He was on his way to the Mohawk country. But they named the baby William Johnson, which doesn't seem a coincidence under the circumstances. But it's again, I say about imagination, like it's really hard to imagine that marriage. We just have these little glimpses of it, and clearly he was he was so in love with her, but he was really worried about her, that she wasn't going to make it to heaven with him. And that's what he was hoping for, because life was very precarious, and as it turns out, he died really soon. So but she went on, and she had more children. She married again, and so her life continued, and we don't know much about it. Again, it's like these archives are so incomplete. They just give us these little windows, and they're important windows, but I always feel very humble in terms of how much I know about all this world, because most of people's communication, even today, of course, is not through writing. It's just ephemeral stuff that will never survive for other people to see.
In your research, have you come across any speculation about Joseph Johnson's death?
No. As I say, though, it's possible that somebody since has made speculations that I'm not on top of. Now I'm gonna have to go back and read some of the more recent things that have been written. I mean, my only speculation is either that he was knocked off by somebody who thought he was a traitor to one side or the other, because he was trying to be friends of Sir William Johnson, and he was also trying to be friends of the governor of Connecticut, And that was perhaps just not possible, you know.
And he's carrying a letter from George Washington.
Yes, he was carrying a letter from George Washington, and he'd asked for a gun to protect himself. You know, he quite possibly was killed.
Plus, he was having some kind of go-around with Elijah Wampy by then. And he was accused of being a traitor. And he was leveling, apparently, different accusations against Johnson. And he feared he mentioned in the letter where he was writing all this, Johnson did, that he feared for his life.
Yeah. So, you know, it wasn't, there were no sort of clear lines of like, you know, who was a soldier and who was a civilian. This is before the Geneva Convention. not that the Geneva Convention is ever really actually practiced or believed, but you know, it was pretty chaotic.
So do we know like how old he was when he disappeared?
Well, he died in sort of, I was only able to narrow it down into a sort of an 8-month window between sort of summer 1775 and summer 1776 and spring 1777, when somebody writes a letter and says, "Oh, I was sorry to hear that Joseph Johnson died. He was such a promising young man." So that's all I know so far.
I don't think anyone's found any more detail. I think you've still got the really eloquent picture of the record going silent on Joseph Johnson. I had a question in your book, Laura, page 239.
Okay.
He's writing to Sir William Johnson. I don't know if William Johnson was alive to receive the letter. It's the month that he died. So, you know, chaos everywhere. But it's July 1774. Yes, I send to your honor 2 small pieces which I composed and got printed, which may perhaps give little satisfaction to the curiosity of some of the gentlemen that resort to your honor's house. I am Hodante Joseph Johnson.
Yeah.
What are those? Do we have any idea? Anybody? I've been trying to dig and find like what that's about. The composition in that time period can refer, it was more commonly used referring to poetry. These could be words, it could be hymn texts, or it could be composition in kind of the more modern sense of, you know, meaning music tunes, music notation. But that he got published, there are, you know, besides identified Occam texts in Occam's hymnal of 1774, there's still 15, 20 or so of unidentified author, unknown texts in Occam's hymnal of 1774. And still today, and with the web and everybody's research, no known earlier publication, no known author of, you know, that decent handful. And so I've speculated. I wonder if perhaps, you know, Joseph Johnson, in whose diaries we've seen this rhapsodic hymnody kind of language. I've lost the page bit, but there was one where he had this very eloquent writing that you mentioned, Laura, as being like biblically cadenced. And actually, I'm Shakedown singer, and I recognize the words right away. Like, oh, this is Isaac Watts. It's in this tune and that tune and the other tune, and we still sing it today out of the Sacred Harp. And like, it's instantly recognizable, super popular hymnody. And he's just, you know, memorized these hymns, and he can just spill them at will into his diary. You know, he's really internalized the hymnody. So I send to your honor 2 small pieces, which I got published and composed, and I've speculated maybe there are a couple of hymns that were in Occam's hymnal, and so maybe he sent a copy of Occam's hymnal, and that's how they got published. And it's the best, because otherwise I don't know that we know of any other publication that he achieved besides that letter to Moses Paul in New Haven jail.
Yeah, well, I suppose something like that might be likely, in that it sounds like, you know, he says there'll be sort of satisfaction to the curiosity. It sounds like the letter to Moses Paul is not likely to be sort of something that the gentlemen are going to want to read with sherry after dinner,
Right.
kind of thing. And so, on the other hand, of course, Johnson was Anglican, Church of England. He wasn't a Methodist, and there
Right.
was a different kind of hymnody, different kind of repertoire there. So I don't know, but
Good.
it's a very good point that you make, that it could be something a little bit maybe smaller and more entertaining, or showing his civilization in some other way. Yeah, I know I didn't find it then, and I haven't found it since, but since we have music on the mind here, no, that's not implausible that there could have been something like that. Yeah.
I have just a random question. How did you stumble upon his diaries? How did that? Were you already at Dartmouth? And
No, I had read these 1939 or 1930s reprints of some of his other writing, right? And so I thought, and I guess that was from the Dartmouth College archive.
Okay.
So I drove up to Dartmouth, and so one of the diaries is there. The other diaries is at New York Public Library. But when it really was. I have to say, I've done archival work since, and you don't often have a find like that. Like, you could spend so many hours doing so much boring stuff. And so in a way, I had that, practically was my first experience working in the archives. I go up there and I say, oh, what is there here from Joseph Johnson? And I guess there's a printed catalog of the Wheelocks papers, and I had access to that. So I guess I knew it was there. And I went up there, and then the fact that it was so personal and so detailed about social history and about community life and everything is nothing that I would have ever expected. So it was pretty, as I said, it was creepy a little bit to be reading somebody else's diary, but on the other hand, it was just amazing because, as you will know, almost all of the writing about Indigenous people in this period is done by outsiders, done by ministers or treaty negotiators or whoever. And so to see a record that is from a community member and really just so descriptive about all these different elements of life was just really exciting. And I don't think we have many other records like that. Often people are surprised who don't necessarily know that much about this, but they're surprised that there even were Indigenous people who are literate in English to be writing a personal diary in English at this time. And I if I had continued in this field, and maybe I will go back, I'd like to go and go to the Dartmouth archives again and get more context for that. But I know there's a historian at Western University in London, Ontario, who's worked a lot on some of the Mohawk students from Quebec who studied at Dartmouth. So there were very few Indigenous people who studied at Dartmouth in the early years. That was all kind of a fraud that Wheelocks perpetrated, and that Occam raised this money in England for the Indian school, and then he starts Dartmouth, and there are hardly any Indigenous students there, but there were a few. And so that guy Tom Peace has written about them and what role they took in their communities subsequently after going to Dartmouth. But Colin Calloway has written a book about the Indian students at Dartmouth. So there's more information there too, I guess. But yeah, I was thinking, I've been going through the Indian agency records for the Alnwick agency of this community in Ontario. And this is from the 1860s to 1900 or so. And it's all been microfilmed, and I'm just going through it, and I'm going through it, and I'm going through it. And it's this sort of, I guess we would call it slow violence of bureaucracy. Like that's how they did. Like, there's kill them with paperwork. That's basically what you see in these archives. But I did, just to, maybe this is a good ending note, to return to singing. I discovered some records about this guy who taught singing, right? And it was an article in a newspaper about his singing. And it's really because the Indian agent is mad because he's been elected chief of this band, and the Indian agent does not want him to be chief. And so he digs up this dirt from the local newspaper that he's an immoral guy teaching singing, etc. But these kinds of moments where you see something of individual lives come through in the documents of the Indian, and you work in this policy area, you may have a sense of it. It's so unusual, and you just spend so much time going through, just being sort of glazed by all of this. So these kinds of documents are rare and powerful for that reason.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was given this book by my father, and he said, you have to read these. they're going to give you a lot of context, and it's going to help you with your work. You got to read these. And so, I was sort of scanning through, and I like to just sort of flip through the pages, right, and sort of see what sort of grabs me. And I remember going through it and actually seeing his handwriting, just like falling over. That, that's a piece of our history right there, and seeing his hand crafted. And I just can't imagine seeing that in person, and holding that book.
Yeah, which he carried around with him every day, right? Like,
Yeah.
the actual book, like, it's this little tiny book, and he just had it with him all the time, and it's the rough draft of his life, I wonder, I don't know that Dartmouth has made this stuff available online, but they sure should. So you should write to them, and if they haven't, you should write to them and say, hey, put facsimiles online of this stuff.
Yeah.
Because reading it, his handwriting is actually pretty decent, and so you can read it, and reading it in the original is really a striking thing to do.
I just imagine I would have thought you would have needed a translator next to you, somebody who is sort of schooled in English at that time, just to help read it. But I was looking at that page and I was like, oh, I can read it. You don't need a translator.
Yeah. Well, so he was a really good student who learned, he did things exactly like he was taught, and then he's really using the master's tools, to build a new house for the people. And in a way, he's doing the thing that a lot of, band members and council members and so on have done ever since, like try to figure out how you can learn the game, of the government without giving up what you care about most. And so he is, in a way, a kind of a forerunner, I think, for a lot of struggles that a lot of people have to go through in their lives, working for their communities. Like, if you get too good at that game, you might lose contact with where you came from. But you have to be good at it. You have to be like better at it than the other side. Seems to me, anyway.
Yeah.
I have a two-part question. Number one, was there anything in his writings that you found surprising? And the second part is, in his writings, were there any indication of his sense of humor?
Oh, really good questions. Well, I think, when we've talked about some of the things about how he's so trying to be a good Christian, but he clearly falls in love with this woman, Sally Hazard, and he falls in love with Tabitha. He's so this isn't humor, but it's emotion. It's not, it's lust. It's like, he's a 21-year-old, whatever, and there he is. He's just mooning over this woman and so on. So I don't know if that's surprising, but it shows the kind of the struggles that he has for his different desires, and his relationship to God is sensual too. It's a really intense thing, and as we talked about, maybe his relation to Mohegan too, when he writes about that. So he's a really emotional person. He's a really emotional person. I guess in some ways the overall surprise was the way that he, for me, because I'm not a religious person, how he could believe in a religion that to me seemed like a really, really kind of oppressive colonialist tool. He believed in it, and he made it work for him, and to really just see how that plays out. Because it's not just any old kind of Christianity. It's this kind of Christianity which is all about, like, showing yourself to just grovel at the face of God. You know, it's not a very affirmative kind of a religion to me, as I can perceive it. And sense of humor. Have any of you who've read it more detailed and more recently than me noticed any sense of humor?
Not that I recall. Occam, he definitely has some, but I don't recall Johnson.
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. I had this question came up with Occam presentation, and yeah, you can find like just hilarious, purposely hilarious stuff in Occam, but I can't think of that in Johnson, which is funny because you're right, Laura. There's actually, I think there's actually more of just personalness and intimacy and ecstatic emotions. I think there's more of all of that sort of human touch in Johnson writings than in Occam, and yet no, not as much humor.
I mean, some of it makes me laugh, but I don't think it's because
right.
It's just, it makes me laugh that, you know, he loses his luggage and he barely misses the boat and all that kind of stuff, or that, you know, and also sometimes he, you know, you can feel that he's really trying to, you know, when he gets to be a teacher and he has to act important and he's like trying to, you know, and there's something sort of funny about that.
How earnest he is about everything.
I mean, you know, he probably, and then from Tabitha's point of view, I mean, he probably was just fairly tiresome sometimes. Like, you know, he kept trying to convert her all this time, and, you know, trying to raise the kids and deal with her life and whatever.
And he talks so much. I wonder if he did the same thing in person that he was doing when he was writing. I mean, just talk.
Very articulate guy. Yeah. Who knows?
Well,
I was really lucky. I think in my research has been going on for some years to be directed very early on to this book. Joanna Brooks wrote, "Oh, you got to read Joseph Johnson's diaries. He's a great guy. You'll love him." And which is like, just, I mean, it's exactly like how it goes. You start reading him, and you just like him more and more and more all through the book. I find him just incredibly likable guy. I like him so much, and I think it is really striking, Laura, that you did this 1998. You know, pretty much before the web as we know it. And you were, and so much has been written since then. It wasn't indigeneity in Revolutionary Era wasn't quite the trendy topic when you made this book that it has become, and so it's just amazing to me how much detail you did find in research. Every time a name appears, you got some note on it. Every time this, you know, Mason land controversy appears, well, you got notes on that. You got notes on the players and the connections. You got the comparison with the Narragansett. Maybe it's informative to look at the Narragansett situation and, you know, the parallels there, which really are parallel, and it's really informative. And it's I think amazing what you put together. It's very readable. It's very clear, and I still feel lucky and grateful that that's what I stumbled into first in this whole incredibly complicated, you know, Brothertown history thing. That it's been such a helpful book for me to just navigate everything else ever since then. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I wouldn't expect that a book that was 20 years ago would have that kind of currency today. But it was really nice for me to have the occasion to reread it again, since I was invited to meet with you guys. And yeah, frankly, I mean, I did think it stands up pretty well. I mean, there are things that I would talk about differently now if I wrote it now. Like, for example, I mentioned earlier, just thinking more about these schools and their kind of the work they did in colonization, and the violence really of them. And so I would think of that in a different framework now, I think. And but a lot of the things that I wrote there, I feel they do kind of hold up, because I was trying to respect what I was hearing from his writing, I guess. Yeah. And I guess I don't know if I could, you know, he would never give me the time of day, because I'm an evil person, you know, because I don't follow the teachings that he so deeply believed in, but I really respect him. And and it's partly just this being aware of how young he was and what he was trying to do as such a young man. You know, like I have a 19-year-old son. Right?
What he did do. He's
My
amazing.
19-year-old son is not like taking on to like, you know, save his community or whatever. And he's certainly not thinking about the Lord. And yet either, you know, like it's just, wow. And at the same time, you know, he's sort of down to earth there with his helping his aunt and helping his uncle and, you know, feeding the horse and all that kind of thing.
And bringing Samson Occam's pig back. I mean, that's the humor. That's the humor that's in Joseph Johnson. Oh, and then I brought Samson Occam's pig back to his property, and then I went home, went to sleep. Like, it's funny, but he's not. It's not his sense of humor.
Yeah, well, maybe we can laugh at him, you know, with fondness. I guess that's how I approach it. So,
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with us and speaking about your book and research.
Well, thank you all so much. It really was just a very welcome invitation, kind of a blast from the past. And if any of you, you know, have any other theories or connections or things that I should know, because I'm back in the archives again, working on Indigenous history from the 1780s, I'm sort of feeling a little bit back in the landscape. And I'm working more on Mohawks than Oneidas, and more on Mississaugas than the Algonquians in New England. But I'm feeling this stuff loops around. I'm thinking a lot about people being displaced from their land in those periods and the tools they had to survive, and what it all means today and what it means to us all today going forward. That's really much the orientation of my work in the Canadian context now. So if any of that, if any of, you know, your work that you're doing in the present connects to this past of Joseph Johnson, that's just the kind of thing that that would interest me to know. Or if you find any other publications that seem related. I might not know about them. I'm sure you guys know more. You've been following up some of this stuff more detailed than I have. So I'm very honored to be here, and I wish you all the best. And I think it's really cool that you're inhabiting these historical worlds at the same time as whatever you're doing today.
Yep.
Thank you for an awesome book.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking the time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch if it seems interesting or useful.
Cool.
Okay, good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Yeah.